I'm Ian Smith. Welcome to Shakespeare, Race, and Queer Sexuality, the 2021 colloquium in the Shakespeare and Race series sponsored by the Keefe Family Foundation. In a demographically plural society, a 21st century education must commit to the project of inclusion and diversity for cultural citizens. This two-part colloquium will engage us in these issues that matter urgently to our lived daily realities, where our racial, sexual, and gender identities have been increasingly placed under the spotlight of cultural legitimacy and belonging. Bias crimes have seen a sharp increase, and public protest has tried to hold us accountable to the unrelenting work of building a fair and just society. Our classrooms, scholarship, and professional academic spaces are not excluded from, but integral to, this work of racial literacy. That is, the fully self-aware, engaged teaching and learning in the service of inclusive, respectful, just living. And yet, while early modern critical race studies and queer studies emerged about the same time, they have led largely independent scholarly existences. Shakespeare, Race, and Queer Sexuality represents a conscious effort in making this history and practice visible, trying to account not only for its past, but more importantly, for the collaborative and intersectional possibilities that lie ahead. To this end, I am delighted to introduce three outstanding scholars, colleagues, and professors of English in conversation. Jean Howard, who teaches at Columbia University, Arthur Little Jr. at UCLA, and Mario De Gangi at Lehman College and the Graduate Center, CUNY. They have accepted the invitation to unpack the disciplinary, pedagogic, and research challenges posed by today's intervention, Shakespeare, Race, and Queer Sexuality, a conversation among scholars. I take this opportunity to thank my fellow co-organizers of this colloquium, David Sterling Brown, Assistant Professor of English at Binghamton University, SUNY, and Diane Wyndham Shaw, Director Emerita of Special Collections at Lafayette College. Lastly, I would like to express our deepest thanks to Alison Byerly, the president of Lafayette College, who has generously supported the mission and educational goals of the Shakespeare and Race series from its inception. And now, here are Jean Howard, Arthur Little, and Mario De Gangi.
Thank you, Ian, for setting this panel off on its work, and thank you, Arthur and Mario, for providing the intellectual firepower for this conversation. It will be wonderful to hear you two speak together on a topic of interest to so many of us who teach, study, or simply enjoy reading Shakespeare. Why and how to bring together queer studies and critical race studies in order to enlarge what his plays can mean and the power they can have now. Shakespeare studies has changed rapidly and substantially during the years in which I have been in the academy. New historicism, feminism, the material history of the book, queer studies, environmental studies, critical race studies, each of these movements has opened new ways to read the text of the early modern theater, has made them newly relevant, and has shown new ways in which the institution of the theater participates in social change. Today, in bringing together dynamic leaders of these two fields, Mario, probably best known as a queer scholar, and Arthur, a leading practitioner of early modern critical race studies, we're offering a unique chance to reflect on the pitfalls and possibilities of intersectional analysis. One could argue that these two movements both had a period of flourishing in the 1990s, not necessarily an origin, but a period of flourishing. And yet they have not always talked to one another very directly or strongly. Today, I hope we can explore why and discuss the possibilities for a more robust intersectional conversation to develop in the future. In the time we have together, I'm going to unpack a series of questions, but first I want to give Mario and Arthur a chance to say a bit about how they describe the methods, the political stakes, and the achievements of their respective subfields within Shakespeare studies. What is early modern queer studies, Mario, and what is early modern critical race studies, Arthur? Discuss, please, and each of you feel free to add to what the other one says. Neither of you is here simply to represent a field, but indeed to speak to the possibilities of our not being confined to a single pigeonhole. So, Mario, let's start with you and queer studies.
Thank you, Jean. I'd also like to thank Ian and my co-panelist, Arthur. So queer studies, before we talk about queer studies, we need to talk about the word queer and what that means. Queer can mean many things today, but I think an easy definition of queer is that it refers to any form of sexual desire, sexual practice, or expression that departs from the societal norm of heterosexuality. And if we think about the acronym that we use a lot these days, LGBTQIA, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersexual, asexual, we can take that acronym as a kind of shorthand that specifies the many different sexual identities that could be considered queer. Today, we also define as queer any gender expressions that are non-normative, such as trans and genderqueer identities. So queer can mean all of those things. Queer theory and queer studies really emerged in the academy in the early 1990s. And I see that emergence as a development out of feminist theory and feminist studies. An important early milestone of queer theory is a 1992 essay by Gail Rubin called Thinking Sex. And in that essay, Rubin argues that, like gender, sexuality is political. And she goes on to enumerate certain forms of sexuality. She says, like heterosexual marriage are celebrated in our culture, whereas other forms of sexual expression, such as S&M, promiscuity, are demonized and oppressed. Now, I would say also that queer theory, although it does encompass a lot of different kinds of academic and critical practices and political practices, I think its main theory, the main theory of queer theory, the main premise of queer theory, is that heterosexuality is not natural or transhistorical, right? That heterosexuality, which is the notion of an innate sexual attraction to the opposite sex that constitutes psychological normality, is a particular way of thinking about human sexuality that emerged in the 19th century, along with the concept of homosexuality. So these terms that we commonly use today and that we have in a way naturalized, we don't think about their origins, homosexuality, heterosexuality, those are concepts that arose at a certain time and place in history and are not universal. So for instance, when you turn to the importance of queer studies for Shakespeare studies, when you read Shakespeare, you will never see the words in Shakespeare, heterosexual, homosexual. Characters in Shakespeare's plays never identify themselves as gay or straight or heterosexual, homosexual. Those concepts, those words simply didn't exist. And it simply means that Shakespeare's culture had different ways of thinking about human sexuality than we do. And queer studies gives us the tools for identifying and analyzing those concepts of sexuality from the past and how they manifest in literature and history. So when we turn to a Shakespeare play, we're not looking for words like heterosexual or homosexual. We're looking for the precise ways that characters in those plays think about their bodies, think about and talk about their sexual erotic experiences and what the significance of those ways of talking are. Finally, I would say, just to give you an example, that queer studies helps us to understand, one of its main benefits is not only to historicize heterosexuality and homosexuality, but it helps us to understand the extremely broad variety of sexual fantasies and practices in which literary characters engage. So example of this is a critic called Valerie Billing, who argues that differences in bodily size in Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis have an erotic significance. So she points out that in that poem, Venus is a very large woman. She's a goddess. She's this dominant large woman. And Adonis is kind of a small, delicate young boy. And she argues that that difference in bodily size is eroticized. And that's a very good example of what a queer reading can notice in a text that hasn't really been noticed before.
Great, thank you very much. I love that, the idea of big and small as erotic categories. Arthur, can you talk a little bit about critical race studies?
Yes. First, thank you, Jean. Thank you, Ian. And of course, thank you, Mario, for this exchange that I've been very much looking forward to. When we talk about critical race studies and critical race theory, we are essentially talking about a field that had its, really came into its prominence in the 1990s and around some groundbreaking work, including, of course, Kim Hall's Thing of Darkness, where she took on the question of race in early modern aesthetics, you know, in paintings and in poems, and talked about how the Black and white imagery that we often talked about as simply a contrast of beauty and the not so beautiful, etc. And she began to talk about how we could see both in the literature as well as in the other arts, how we could begin to think about those in aesthetic terms. And that helped us begin to think more deliberatively about questions of race, and in particular, particularly in the way that she was modeling it. She was very interested in Black feminist thought and how Black feminism could help us read or think about early modern texts, that is, texts in Shakespeare and around Shakespeare's time. Now, the field itself, in larger terms, and we'll come back to that, but the field in larger terms really started much earlier, one could say. And that would take us back to the 1940s and the 1960s through the era of colonialism and such, and writers who began to try to think about Shakespeare in those contexts and think about how Shakespeare, for example, was being fed to colonized populations, and what it meant that Shakespeare was getting constructed as a particular image for a particular kind of being that was then being exported to certainly to British colonies and such. So when we talk about the field, we are talking about kind of a mesh of race studies, if you will, and also of critical race theory. And when we talk about critical race theory more formally, we're talking about a movement that actually came out of law schools and is generally abbreviated as CRT. And critical race theory in that context was particularly vibrant or got it started in the 1980s and moved forward and is now part of a global conversation. And that thinking about critical race theory was arguing that, or argues that what looks to be neutral or what looks to be blind in the law is actually far from blind. And in this sense, it's this question of what looks to us as though we are dealing with the equitable already has built into it a whole network of social values and social positions that really reflect, at the end of the day, all kinds of, you could say, racial work. And what we have done in law is, or what has been done in law, was to then to go back and to start to look at the law from the perspective of trying to read it through a much more racially conscious lens in order to kind of reveal what race was doing in the legal text. Now, when we bring that over into literature, it's very important that when we bring that over into literature, what we are doing is not going into text and making up race or finding instances and saying, oh, we can make that into a, they're using the word white here, they're using the word black, we can take that and make that into a metaphor for race. That is not what we are doing in the field. What we're doing is asking or sort of examining how race or racialization works in these same texts. And it may be around imagery of whiteness or around images of blackness that we often think about when we think about race in our own cultural moment. We often think about it in terms of skin color. But that is only the very beginning of the conversation. More pertinent to the conversation is for us to think about how we go about defining those who we think of as full citizens, or people who have access to full citizenship, and those who do not. And another way in which we put that is to think about the ways in which literature and other cultural productions create a multiplicity of categories for all of us. And that is those of us, to quote one critic, Alexander G. Wahelier, that it is to create these categories of the human, the not quite human, and the non-human. And in that sense, we could think about, for example, if we were to sort of overlay that onto some of our own immediate cultural experiences, we would think of the humans as white, the not so human as, say, brown people or immigrants. And we would think of the not humans as Black. And so how do we go around in our cultural imaginary and think of figures as human or not? And the question for us is, and how do we, as Shakespeareans, how do we bring this knowledge or these questions to Shakespeare? And why to Shakespeare? And one of the reasons why we bring it to Shakespeare is because we think of Shakespeare as being at the center of Western modernity. We think of Shakespeare as giving us the invention of the modern human being. And so that if Shakespeare is going to be instrumental to this creation, whether real or imagined, but if Shakespeare is going to be instrumental to the creation of this modern human being, then we want to examine how race plays and what role race plays in those particular constructions. And so it's just going back to the ground to do that.
That's great. Okay, you've both talked a little bit about the fields that you've helped to create. So today we're here really to talk about what happens when you put those fields together. How do we do that? And the first question I have for you is, why should we want to? That is, what's the urgency of doing some kind of union, imbrication, conversation of fields here? And I guess we'll start with you, Mario. Why do you want to do this? Why do you think it's important and urgent?
Yeah, I think it's urgent because these fields actually share certain intellectual and political projects or desires. So for instance, queer studies and critical race studies can be considered practices that have a shared political investment in terms of denaturalizing their objects of study. So what I mean by that is in queer studies, as I mentioned earlier, one of the real aims of queer studies is to denaturalize heterosexuality, right? To say that heterosexuality is not normal, it's not natural, it's not universal, it's a historical product of a certain time and place. And as such, it has certain material consequences on people who are defined in that way or not defined that way or defined as other to that. And at the same time, critical race studies similarly has a political investment in denaturalizing whiteness, right? That it holds that whiteness is not natural or normal or universal, but a historical construct that has societal implications and impacts bodies in certain ways. So I do think that queer studies and critical race studies really can work together in terms of this larger project of historicizing concepts that have been taken to be natural and that as such have had some detrimental effects, especially on people who are defined as other or marginalized to those categories. I think another really important reason, and I'm coming at this now specifically from the perspective of a queer studies scholar, and I've been very influenced by the work of a very important contemporary African-American scholar. His name is Roderick Ferguson. And he's advocated what he advocates the study of race as, quote, an epistemological intervention into the study of sexuality. So again, race can serve as an epistemological intervention into the study of sexuality. And epistemology just means the study of knowledge, how we produce knowledge. So what he means by this is how might a focus on race change what we think we know about sexuality, right? How are concepts of sexuality already shot through with racial concepts and ideologies? So the implication of this work for me is it's not that some of us would be inclined to do sexuality studies to look at sexuality in Shakespeare and then say, as Arthur said, oh, you know, here's this word fair or this word white. I'm just going to bring race into this and see, you know, how I can try to explain that particular word. It's not that. It's not race as a kind of additive onto sexuality. The idea is that we can't fully understand sexuality and its operations, including its operations in a literary text, unless we are already taking account of race and the ways that race informs sexuality. So just to use Arthur's example, if race is implicated in how we define the human, this could also be implicated in sexuality, right? That sexuality also could be part of how we define the human, right? We know from reading Renaissance travel writers that they sometimes accused Africans of being bestial, of committing bestiality, right? Of having sex with animals, right? So sex there is being used as a way to dehumanize a whole population of people, right? And so again, it's crucial to understand those kinds of gestures or ideological moves. It's crucial to understand that race and sexuality very often are working in conjunction. And it's just, we always haven't recognized that conjunction.
Arthur, what would you say is the reason that we should be focusing on bringing these two together?
Yes, I would agree with everything that Mario has brought to the conversation. This sense of difference between the two is really much more of, I would say, a disciplinary and political choice of sorts, which is to say that we obviously can't do everything. And part of what we've done in race studies and part of what critics have done in queer studies is really thinking about different forms of embodiment. Like if you go back to the poetic example, for example, that Mario gave in his introductory remarks, so that when we were talking about the ways in which a body gets raced, or when we're talking about the ways in which a body gets sexualized, we are really talking about, or one of the things that we're really talking about here is the way embodiment functions as part of our social and political matrices. And so that what we're trying to do is in effect understand the ways in which our bodies and our subjects are sort of turned into social props, right? Or turned into political props. And that investment, that interest is at the center, in my thinking, of both queer theory, and it is at the center as well, of course, of critical race studies. And what it is in terms of their meeting is also something that Mario was emphasizing, which is often these are paired. And so there's this way in which a body gets race is at times through the way that body gets imagined in terms of its sexual proclivities, let's say, and the ways in which the body gets gendered, the ways in which, for example, the bodies of so often in American slavery, for example, and to a lesser extent in British context, but that the way in which Black slaves would be looked at as ungendered property. And so it was this way in which the Black body, in a sense, was in excess of its gender, and so, or sex. And so there always this dialogue going on, in essence, between race and sexuality. And we see this, say, even in Shakespeare. And if we just think about it in sort of really generic terms, when we read or experience Shakespeare's romantic comedies, we are experiencing these dramas that are usually, at least on the surface, working their way towards some kind of affirmation of heterosexuality, while at the same time, these dramas with their heroines at the center are often also working their way towards some ideas about white femininity. And so the ways in which these texts, in senses, will load up both heterosexuality and whiteness onto the same body is something that is of interest, or that we need to think about. And that sense of co-option from one side to the other is not only something that is going to be, or is important to Shakespeare, but it's also important to us, I think.
You know, you both made a good case of why these fields should talk to one another at a very fundamental level, at the levels of epistemology and embodiment. Why do you think they've stayed apart for so long? I mean, not totally apart, but largely apart since the 90s. How do you think about that, Arthur? Yeah, let's have you start this time.
Great question. I'll start with a quick reflection on myself, actually, as someone who is invested both in queer studies and in race studies, and made the very conscious decision to move from queer studies into race studies more properly. Part of it was the sense that queer studies was doing what I would think of it in very simple terms as more white work, whereas I felt as in that was not getting interrogated, and that I would perhaps find it more productive to focus on sort of the racial side of things. And a part of why that split would be there is because I think at the time when we think about them institutionally, that everyone was sort of fighting for, you can say, the crumbs at the table of the academy. And there was also a lot of politics driving these conversations. And so there was a sense for queer studies that it needed to be taken more seriously as part of the academy. And this was not just a bunch of queer people or queer scholars trying to throw a party. And on the racial side of things, the sense of the exclusion, particularly for Black scholars and Black Shakespearean scholars, of really being pushed to the margins, even if we were at the margins of the academy in general, and particularly when it came to Black Shakespeare scholars, there was a sense that we were this kind of odd, this odd commodity, if that. And so what we were fighting for was also just legitimacy in the academy. And in that sense, I think the political needs of the race scholars and the political needs of the queer scholars were just focused in very different places. And also, as we went through that, there was a social dimension to this as well, of Black scholars and other scholars of color really supporting each other inside the academy, and queer scholars doing very much the same on their end of things. And so my sense was a lot of it was not just the intellectual questions, where, again, as we've talked about already, that there are some obvious places of intersection, but a lot of it also came out of, I think, the political and social moments that we are talking about.
And Mario, what would you say about why these two fields didn't come together sooner in conversation?
Yeah, I'm just going to flesh out a little bit what Arthur said about what kind of work queer studies scholars were doing in the 90s when he kind of determined to put more emphasis in critical race studies. And there are important differences in how queer studies and race studies developed as critical fields in early modern studies. So I'll just talk a little bit about early modern queer studies. It emerged really in response to two critical influences. One was an extremely influential study called The History of Sexuality by French philosopher Michel Foucault that was translated into English into 1978 and really galvanized work on the history of sexuality and queer studies in the past. And the second major influence for early modern queer studies was the work of feminist Shakespeare scholars in the 1980s. So Foucault's study was very Eurocentric and had very little to say about race. And so queer scholars who took that up really ended up replicating that. And in the 80s, feminist critics were doing crucial work on gender roles, marriage, female power, cross-dressing in Shakespeare. But when they addressed sexuality, these critics tended to focus on heterosexual relationships. So in response, lesbian and gay early modern scholars began to turn their attention to same-sex relationships in the plays and stressed sexual acts and desires as distinct from gender roles. But just as early feminist critics tended to overlook race, again, so did early queer scholars. In kind of responding to feminism and trying to develop it in these new directions, they again replicated that absence of work on race. Another thing that complicated this, or that compounded this in queer early modern scholarship, was that these scholars focused on those texts in which same-sex relationships were most evident. So these would be plays like Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, As You Like It, Henry IV, Coriolanus, all of which feature prominent same-sex relationships, but do not include any Black characters. So again, that kind of obvious impetus to talking about race that you might have in a play like Othello, it wasn't there in those other plays. Just to give one counterexample, there was one early queer scholar who did address race in his work, and that was Jonathan Goldberg. And he wrote about how European colonists violently attributed sexual transgressions and sodomy to Native Americans. But I think that example is noteworthy because race had been more central to studies of the early modern Americas, as David said before, in part because of the importance of slavery, than race had been to studies of early modern England. So again, that raises the point that Arthur was making about kind of different histories and investments of scholarly fields, right? American studies always was more focused on race than early modern British studies. Just a final point about why this separation has continued in the last 20 years or so. Scholars have begun to integrate race and sexuality into their work, including very important work that's been done by Arthur Little and Ian Smith that integrates both sexuality and race. But I think there's still an ingrained scholarly habit of keeping these marginalized or minority fields, as Arthur said, the fields that are trying to get like a place at the table in the academy. There's a habit of keeping these kinds of fields distinct. And that creates obstacles for this kind of integration of sex and race that we're talking about. I'll just give you one example. A recent textbook called A New Companion to Renaissance Drama that was published in 2017, right? And it has a chapter on race and early modern drama, which has a very brief discussion of sex. And it has a completely separate chapter on sexuality and queerness on the early modern stage that says nothing about race. And I just think it's because when, as an editor, you're saying, I'm going to have this person write the race chapter, I'm going to have this other person write the queer chapter, and you're missing the opportunity for precisely that kind of intersection when you divide knowledge in those ways. And that continues to be a problem.
And I would just like to add one small piece to that, which is the way in which when we're talking about race, right, we also have a habit of thinking that we are often talking about Black and brown bodies, and that we are not talking, right, as well about whiteness. And that becomes really key here, because I think in terms of our staying away from each other, from the race studies perspective, the way in which Mario pointed to this, the way that queer studies was thinking of race when it did in a few instances, it was often thinking about the presence of Black bodies, the presence of characters such as, say, an Othello or an Aaron, or in rare cases, a Cleopatra. But it was not thinking about what was right there in front of everyone's face, which was whiteness, and taking seriously the racial constructions of whiteness as a way as well, sort of to think about these questions of sexuality, etc.
I have one more question before we move to some examples, and that is about how we expand our critical conversations. And I'm thinking about a range of new fields or subfields that have emerged that seem very urgent, besides race and sexuality. And one is disability studies in the early modern field, and the other is environmental studies in the early modern field. And do you think that these two new conversations will somehow be able to be in interesting conversation with queer and race studies? Do we need to move beyond the dyad to something bigger in the coming years, particularly around these two, what I feel are also very urgent movements in our larger field? And maybe they're different. Maybe you wouldn't think about disability studies and in the environment in the same way. But I'd be interested in what you think. Mario, would you be willing to go first on that?
Sure. I will just say something about disability studies. I was recently reading an article by a couple early modern disability scholars, and it was very interesting because they said that they have essentially the same challenge to establishing the legitimacy and pervasiveness of their field. Like disability studies is something, they believe that we all should be thinking about, right? What defines an able body or disabled body in the past, in Shakespeare's time. And it's precisely the problem that Arthur just talked beautifully about in terms of whiteness, right? Where there was a long time, I think hopefully this is beginning to change now that there's more awareness of whiteness as race and critics of race not only looking at Black characters, but again, for the longest time there was this idea that if you were working on race in Shakespeare, you were working on Othello, or Titus Andronicus with Aaron the Moor, or Antony and Cleopatra with Cleopatra the Black Egyptian, right? And the same thing these disability scholars are saying when people ask them, what kind of scholarship do you do? And they say disability studies in Shakespeare. And they say, oh, Richard III, Richard III, the famous humpbacked, crippled, character who's been wonderfully portrayed in modern performances in very striking ways as, disabled and having crutches and so forth. And they say, oh, well, of course, you have to talk about Richard III, Shakespeare's most famous physically disabled character. But again, disability has so many wider connotations, again, about how we define what's human, how we define what's normal, how we define who has access to certain kinds of institutions or resources. And I do think one interesting development in disability studies, early modern disability studies, has been precisely to think about disability in terms of race and sexuality, right? In other words, can we consider certain racialized subjects as disabled in a world that only values whiteness? Or can we think about certain kinds of sexualized subjects as again, like is it a kind of disability in a world where heterosexual marriage is promoted as the norm, right? And so for me in particular, I think I'm really looking forward to see how disability studies continues these kinds of conversations, bringing in these different critical strands.
Yeah, I think all those questions about embodiment, norms, what's natural, all of those make disability studies fit very well with critical race studies and queer studies. Arthur, do you have something to add, and maybe about perhaps the more challenging question of the environment and whether or not that is also part of the conversation around race and queer studies? It can be, should be. How would it be brought in, or is that something just to be developed?
I think I'm very interested in what Mario was saying. I'm going to go back for a moment, though, to what I think is the larger question here. And in terms of thinking about critical race studies, for example, my sense is similar to what I understand to have come out of critical race theory, that is CRT, the formal critical race theory out of the legal world, which is that it's become this global project that is now also connected to questions of sexuality, to questions of the environment, to questions of disability, et cetera. But at the core of it they've been quite successful in this regard. It has remained a field that really has race at its center. Mm-hmm. And so, and I say that not to say, for example, that that queer studies we should talk to queer studies and they should step to the side and we should remain at the center. It is to say that we could still do, say, the race work and queer work and talk about them in conversation without marginalizing the one or the other, by also being clear the position that we are taking. And I think it's more dangerous if we say step into disability studies and we simply sort of co-opt disability studies in when my, say, particular aim would be critical race studies. And so I think, so part of it is staying open or staying explicit about the particular intellectual agendas or political agendas that we are bringing to any of these discussions. And so I would want to resist what I see as a kind of a liberal tendency to want to simply sort of put us all in the room together so that we can all get along, so to speak, and where it's much more productive and I think intellectually honest if we can put the queer people in conversation with the race people in a conversation that's really when we're really trying to think about race, and we can do that also in terms vice versa, right, with the queer people, and so, or the queer scholars. And so I think that is important for us not to be reaching for a kind of some kind of liberal fantasy of we'll just take all of these and join them together and then produce this this great mesh of things. In terms of the environment, of course, when we talk about the environment, we all know, particularly from our own vantage, how important the environmental politics are to constructions of race. And the way in which race the ways in which the pristine environment is protected for the for those who have, and not for, and is certainly for not for those who do not have. I think about this from yet another position, not so much simply what goes on in Shakespeare's works, and I think we can there talk about the way, particularly as I say in the comedies, the environments work with creating these heterosexual environments. We're often in the woods, and there's all of this kind of natural world that is also reinforcing all the natural heterosexual and racializing processes that are going on in the heterosexualization that is going to make us all feel really elated when we get to the end of whatever romantic comedy, correct? But I also think about this in relationship to going to Shakespeare in the Park, and not necessarily the formal one in New York, but just general across America. And this idea of a community going into the park to sit outside and to celebrate the summer weather, et cetera, and to also experience a Shakespeare play. And so that seems to me too one of those ways in which Shakespeare then gets invited into the environment as being in affinity with it. And I go to those productions at times and I think about the constitution of those audiences and what it is, it often with a Shakespeare play they can barely hear, but they're there and they're laughing at all the right moments. And it just seems to me to be this cultural ritual more so than anything. And there's a ritual that strikes me as very much sort of scripted around kind of a kind of racialized environmental politics. And we need to think about that too, when I think when we're sort of thinking about the uses of Shakespeare within the in the environment. And of course, when we're talking about environmental politics in terms of early modern criticism, very little of it, if any, but very little of it, I would say, has anything to do with race. And again, and I think part of that is because it's like, well, Othello isn't in it. And so they resort back to what Mario was talking about, is those particular instances, and then race disappears because there are no from their perception, I assume, no raced bodies in the environment. And so some of these areas will, so in essence, I think environmental studies is quite different from disability studies in that we would want to, I think, be engaged in conversation with disability studies without trying to sort of take over their their institutional space, intellectual institutional space, whereas I think environmental studies could very much use some of that disruption.
Yeah, because in the largest sense, racial injustice and environmental injustice are fundamentally linked as big systems. And maybe we need different scales of analysis to bring those two into conjunction in a way that terms like embodiment are a little more obviously ways to bring together some of the other fields we've been talking about. I think it would be helpful to everybody if we also rooted our discussion today in some more examples. And we've been talking kind of theoretically about how these fields do speak to one another, could have not spoken. But could you each take just one example of a Shakespeare play that you think is really usefully opened up if we try to think intersectionally about the way in which sexuality and race work together? A queer analysis and a critical race studies analysis can work together in the classroom. So Mario, do you want to start that? What's your example?
Sure. So my example is going to be Midsummer Night's Dream. And this is another play that doesn't explicitly have like an African or Black character. It's also an excellent example of what Arthur was just talking about in terms of plays that feature the natural environment and the kind of male-female coupling that happens when all these young lovers go into the woods, right? And I also want to acknowledge that Arthur has written wonderfully on this play. So I urge people to look that up if you're interested in Midsummer Night's Dream. I just want to talk about one moment from the play, which is a really crucial moment at the beginning that in a sense sets the terms for the conflict in the play. And if you remember, what's happening in this play is you have fairies, you have the king and queen of fairies, Oberon and Titania, and they're at war. And their war has produced all kinds of environmental disorder. The rains are washing away the floods, and it's cold when it should be warm. And so the conflict of the two fairies is in fact really meaningful and has a lot of impact in the world of the play. But at the cause of this war between Titania and Oberon is over a love that Titania has had for a votress of hers. A votress is like a kind of nun, like a servant of hers, right? And we learn that this votress was from India. And so what we have in Titania's story about this votress that she loved is a story of a homoerotic relationship between a mistress and her kind of female servant, or kind of a hierarchical homoerotic relationship. But it's also a cross-racial relationship in a sense. Now, it's talking about the race of fairies is complicated, but there's a way in which we can think of fairies as their kind of own race. And it's the specificity of India in Titania's story about the votress that really interests me. So basically what she says, she relates the story that she and her votress used to sit together in the spiced Indian air. And spices, of course, were a major import from India into Europe at this time. So a lot of the language in this speech kind of references merchandise, global merchandising, and colonialism. So they sat together in the spiced air. Titania says her votress would sail upon the land to fetch me trifles and return again as from a voyage rich with merchandise. This language is full of these references. Trifles was a word used in Shakespeare's time to refer to kind of worthless foreign fashion goods that would be imported. And the idea of a voyage rich with merchandise references that English trade with India began in the late 1580s. And a few years after Midsummer Night's Dream in 1600, the East India Company formed, which was a major engine of trade, but also colonization of India. And so the speech references all of these colonial matters. So the end of this speech is Titania relates how this votress died in childbirth and gives Titania her son, her Indian son, to raise. But because of those Indian contexts, I think the son becomes a kind of valuable exotic commodity. And the ownership of the son is the contention between Oberon and Titania, who owns this Indian boy. So we can see Titania's resistance to giving the boy to Oberon. She refuses to give him the boy because she wants to honor the desire of her dead votress to raise her son. Her resistance to Oberon is both a sign of her queer love for a dead woman, and it's also a kind of appropriation, a kind of colonial appropriation of a native treasure from India. So again, using the lens of both queerness and race, we see a kind of complexity in this moment that we otherwise might miss if we just focus on one thing or the other.
Thanks. Arthur, do you have an example you want to give?
Yes, I would like to reflect for just a moment on Romeo and Juliet. And I want to do so for both to talk about the intersection of queer studies and critical race studies, but also to talk about them also individually as fields we don't normally attach to Romeo and Juliet. And so I'm trying to accomplish several things with this example to get us to think about what is the value of talking about critical race studies more broadly than so talking about Othello, and what is the value of talking about queer studies, and what's the value then of putting them together. And I love Romeo and Juliet for this example because it's a play that we don't often think about in terms of queerness or in terms of race. And particularly this play that is driven by what seems to be this very normative heterosexuality. It's a play that has come so often in our culture, this celebration of the heterosexual love of adolescence, etc. And the problem with that is, I would argue that it is not the play. And so one of the things that happens with these readings as well is not, and it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, it is not an imposition of queerness onto the play Romeo and Juliet, or an imposition of race onto the play of Romeo and Juliet. It is about exposing often the presence of these discourses in the text themselves. And so that in this case, for example, Romeo and Juliet, and so what we do with this, which is again, as a quick preamble to this, so what we end up doing is, our general readers, is we stop hearing the rest of the play. We stop seeing what these works are doing, the complexities of these works, once we have our own kind of imaginative version of what this play is. So in the case of Romeo and Juliet, for example, we often pass over, if indeed it is not truncated, the very opening of the play, for example, which is Samson and Gregory, if you recall, Samson and Gregory having a lot of street banter, and then of course that is going to lead to the first big scuffle that we see in the play, and then we'll end up at some point getting to Romeo and finding out that he is somewhere, he's been off pining for Rosaline. But in passing over that moment, we're passing over, you could say, one of the keys, or one of the templates for the play. Because part of what's so interesting about Samson and Gregory is they're having this discussion of both about rape, but also about being coal carriers. And that is as though they were sort of working in coal mines, which would also blacken them, which is very interesting given Shakespeare's tragedy right before this, Titus Andronicus, where we talk about the coal black moor. And so that language of the coal black moor, if you will, is carried over from Titus Andronicus into the opening of of Romeo and Juliet, and we have to ask ourselves, why is that there? And if I were also thinking about that opening scene, I would also want to know, in all the banter that's going on between Samson and Gregory, which is loaded with sodomitical, with images of sodomy, and their kind of sexual banter, not only about women, but about their relationship to each other, that it makes me begin to hear, once I pay attention to their language, it also makes me begin to hear resonances between their names, right? Samson and Gregory, and in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so there's this sense of how in this play that I would also want to add, where it continues to get hotter and hotter and hotter as this play goes on, is that speaking of environmental things, and so that what we have is a play that opens with the sense of a threat. And that threat is both a threat of this displaced Blackness, or this kind of unanchored, unmoored Blackness for whatever reason, and of this queerness, this kind of queer violence that we see going on with Samson and Gregory. Why does that give us the setup for Romeo and Juliet? Now, we can all come up with different reasons and have a great conversation about what we think is going on there. But the point for today that I want to just underscore here is it's there, right? And so what we do with it can be a matter of great discussions in many papers. In the same way is we have inside to play the character of Mercutio. And Mercutio, who takes on, as many critics, as Mario knows, many critics have talked about the queerness of Mercutio. And Mercutio, who is this figure who was operating in the play as this kind of outsider, and who I have, in some recent work of mine, wanted to talk about in terms of what I'm calling his Blackness. And that is to say, the ways in which he doesn't fit the white narrative that the play is continuously reproducing. And what I mean by that very quickly is the way, if you remember, right, Rosaline is very fair. And then when Juliet comes along, it's like, oh my God, I thought that Rosaline was white, but nobody is whiter than Juliet. And and that is replicated as well in Arthur Brooks's in the source text for the play. And so that is not just some accidental property that's there. And so in the production of this kind of white heterosexual, or in the production of the love story of Romeo and Juliet, there is all of this attention to how white they are, both Romeo and Juliet, and the threat of the queerness and the Blackness. And so when we're thinking about that play, we also have to sort of account for that language and discourse, which helps us think about then how the play is trying to think about Romeo and Juliet as characters. And when we cut out all that material, when we stop hearing it or stop seeing it, we're doing what Toni Morrison warns about when she's talking about the lobotomizing of text, right? So we have taken the text of Romeo and Juliet, and we have essentially emptied out its queerness and emptied out its Blackness, if you will, in order to have this pristine text of Romeo and Juliet. And that in itself becomes subject, I think, to, or should become subject to both critical race readings and queer theory readings as well.
That's great, Arthur. I think what you're left with in Romeo and Juliet, if you lobotomize it, is those statues at the end, dead as doornails, right? White as can be. That's really great. I want to close with one more question for both of you, and I want to look ahead. And you've really both demonstrated today how a conversation between queer studies and critical race studies is extremely generative for our work of thinking about Shakespeare in our own time. How do we advance this conversation in the next 10 years? Do you see ways in which this is going to go forward? Will something new happen? Do we need new tools to make it happen? Yeah, what's going to happen? Mario, let's go to you.
Sure. I have a couple thoughts about where we can go with this conversation in the future. So earlier, when I was talking about the way that academic institutions tend to segregate knowledge so that we have like the experts on queer studies here and we have the experts on race here and they don't necessarily talk. I talked about a recent textbook that reproduces that kind of siloing or separation of knowledge. So I do think that these textbooks or large anthologies that kind of define the state of the field are really crucial in academia for kind of establishing this is the state of this field right now. This is the kind of work that's being done. This is where the urgency lies, right? I'm very happy to say that I'm trying to advance this kind of discussion we're having by being a co-editor of a new forthcoming anthology called the Handbook of Intersectionality in Early Modern Literature. And we're asking each contributor to that volume to discuss race, gender, and sexuality, like together, or race and gender and class, or some kind of intersection. So intersectionality is a word that we've been using today, and it just is, it actually comes out of this same tradition of critical race studies, that legal tradition that Arthur was talking about in the 80s, I believe. And it really means, the idea of intersectionality is that we all have identities that kind of overlap with each other and intersect with each other in complicated ways. So for instance, I would be a white, gay, working class Italian American, right? Like those are all kind of distinct identities that don't always go with each other, but in me, they all intersect. And that creates a kind of complicated social identity that then, as Arthur was saying, has implications in how you're treated by the law and so forth, right? So we are, my co-editors and I are really deliberately writing this handbook, editing this handbook of intersectionality as a way to promote this kind of intersectional discussion we've had today. The second area, again, with enormous institutional impact, is teaching and the curriculum. So when we teach, as I do at my school, the standard kind of early British literature survey, which I think we all do in some form or other. In my school, it's Chaucer to Milton, right? It's very typical kind of core requirement of English majors. How can we make these kinds of conversations between sex and race happen, or be essential, again, to such courses? Not just be, today, on Thursday, we're going to talk about race. And then the rest of the class, we're just going to talk about canonical white authors, right? It has to be really integrated and thought and baked into the class. I also think it has tremendously important implications for curriculum change. So just to give you a final example, I teach at Lehman College, part of the City University of New York. And Lehman College is a Hispanic serving institution, an HSI, which means that the majority of our students are Latina. And also we have a very large population of African-American students. We're in the Bronx, right? That's our student population. Just this year, the English department revised its curriculum for the English major so that those British literature surveys, which would be Chaucer to Milton, Milton to 18th century or so forth, those are now not part of our core requirements for English majors. We removed those as core requirements. And in their place, we've put as requirements for every English major, a class in Latinx literatures and a class in African-American literatures, to reflect that this is the student group we're teaching, that they need to see their histories and identities affirmed in this very official public institutional way, that those literatures matter, And it's a support I fully, it's a change that I fully supported. At the same time, as a Shakespearean and as a person who taught those British courses that are no longer required, it puts me and my colleagues in the situation of really having to think carefully about what are we doing when we are teaching Shakespeare or Chaucer and Milton to largely a population of kind of working class African-American and Latinx students, right? How can we make those texts speak to them? You know, and again, what can we do in the classroom to make those conversations happen? And I think part of that involves, as I think Arthur was kind of saying before, like really being honest about our political investments and about the stakes of the things that we study. And I think for us in this situation, for me, teaching Shakespeare at an HSI, it means addressing in the classroom how Shakespeare, for instance, has been used as a kind of tool of racial and sexual hegemony over the centuries. You know, how Shakespeare was taught to, Indians under British colonial rule, right? The way that Shakespeare has been kind of mobilized in ways that have, continued to marginalize people who have not been part of the dominant, social structure. So I think we need to really integrate that into our teaching as well.
Arthur, what would you say? What's ahead? What do we need to do?
I would say that the future is, and I don't mean this in a solipsistic way, but I will say the future is me. The future is the figure in the classroom. You know, I appreciate everything that Margot, calling up Margot here. There you go. It's an honor, Mario. All right. I appreciate everything that Mario is saying. And particularly going back to where Mario was talking about himself from a working class background, Italian American, et cetera, is there's a lot of that work I don't have to do, right? So I walk into the classroom and my students know that I am, from what they can see, that I am Black. They know that even though they don't know my own particular relationship to my Blackness, but they know that I'm Black. And they often, in my institutional environment where I've been for a while, they also know that I'm queer. And so when I walk into the classroom, that queerness and that Blackness are there, and is there when I talk about, whatever aspects of Shakespeare, and is there and I use it in a sense to try to sort of create this conversation. When I say use it, even if I don't call direct attention to it, even though, of course, there I am. And I will at some point during a term bring that explicitly into the conversation. But is there when I talk, say, about a Shakespeare play or poem or what have you, and I'm not talking about race. And that in itself, to have a Black professor in a classroom who isn't talking about race in a particular moment, turns that into a particular kind of racial lesson for the students in the classroom, who are so often used to seeing, when we see non-white others, it's usually in the context of them talking about their particular ethnicity or race, et cetera, right? And so having the presence of, so putting them in that presence of a Shakespearean who is not always talking about race, there's a lot of other things to get to talk about as well in Shakespeare, is part of that. And so when we're talking about the coming together too as race scholars and coming together, race scholars and queer scholars, And one, like I said, I'm both, but also it's also the sense of challenging, like Mario was talking about, the ways in which Shakespeare not only has been traditionally taught, but challenging their thinking about who should be standing in front of the classroom when they walk in, right? So I'd rather have a group of students who have no clue who is going to teach them Shakespeare, which I can sometimes get from our non-major class, which is largely freshmen, which I love teaching in the fall before they have any idea who I am, because to walk in starts to do racial work, even if I say nothing. And so that in itself becomes a part of what I am also trying to get at intellectually and politically in terms of who or what Shakespeare is about. And in a sense, when we start talking about queerness and race, and it's sort of where our particular sympathies are, that is also important to stay open and to express openness, about these other areas of inquiry, like you were talking about, Jean, right? When we talk about disability studies and environmental studies, feminist studies, of course, is to bring all of those continuously together, but not necessarily in predictable ways, and and at predictable moments. And that helps sort of enlarge the conversation, so that I think one of the things that we quote unquote suffer from, both as Black scholars, say, or queer scholars, is this sense of an agenda, right? And it's like, no, one is trying to not sort of be driven by, it's not an agenda at work as much as it is an attempt to unveil the racism, the sexism, the homophobia that ends up essentially taking over Shakespeare, holding Shakespeare hostage. And so it's just to sort of, free Shakespeare from, from the racism, from the sexism, from the homophobia. And that becomes key. And at the same time, while doing that, we as scholars can also, I hope, remain respectful of each other, so that and understand our different institutional histories. And so while both queer studies and critical race studies are, for example, enjoying more institutional belongingness right now, that our hold, all of us, our hold on the academy, or within the academy, is still very tenuous. And as such, it's still very important for reasons both intellectual and political, and for reasons, yes, intellectual, social, and political, for us to also at the same time really protect sort of the value of critical race theory, not just for all of us, but also particularly for scholars of color. And I would say the same for queer scholars of whatever race or ethnicity. And so with that sense of protecting those histories, I think we're then in a position to actually come together and do more work and to produce more. And so I'm very excited, for example, about, ever since I heard about it, what Mario is doing, I'm very excited about that, because it sounds like one of those places where the object isn't for one of these to come in and to sort of take over the other, but to start with a very genuine conversation that allows intersectionality to work. And in a sense, we have to create safe spaces, intellectual spaces for that, right? Because if we don't, there would be, I would say, a tendency for the whiteness that undergirds so much queer theory, queer studies, to really take over race studies, which is largely driven at its core by Black and Latinx scholars. And it would be very easy at one level for white queer scholars to come in and to use their whiteness in effect to really sort of marginalize those of us who are essential to really keeping that field bona fides. And so, yeah, and that recognition also has to be on the part of white queer scholars who have to also understand that there are lots of, there's a lot that as white people, as white scholars, there's a lot they don't know. Which I know when we're sort of talking about quote unquote white people, that is often a really hard hill to climb. But if we can put the key, but if we can do that, and if we can have perhaps some honesty and some laughter in the process, I think we can get there.
That's a great way to end, Arthur. And I just want to thank you again, both of you, for taking part in this conversation. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
My thanks and appreciation to our superb panelists. And thank you for joining us for this first session. I hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for part 2, Shakespeare, Race and Queer Sexuality, An Actor Speaks, on April 7, 2021.